After having watched season 1 of The Acolyte and distancing myself somewhat from it in the past few days to reflect on everything we got in the show, I feel there's a lot of unanswered points or questions. Some of them I'm not even sure you can answer, so that's why I was wondering if perhaps you could explain any of them to me. First off though, I just want to respond to something that a lot of people have mentioned on social media over the past few weeks of this show. That being, if you don't like The Acolyte, you can't even voice your opinion about it, letting people know that you're disappointed or that you would like some change to occur. Because then, people argue that, oh, why do you keep watching the show then, if all you do is hate on it? Well, in order to make up your mind, you should watch the show for your own sake. Not just read other people's reviews, or watch their videos and believe, yeah, that's it. Now, if you supposedly hate the show without having watched it, people would instead say, well, you haven't even watched it, how can you hate it? That's not fair. So, no matter what you say, one side is always going to critique you for not liking it, and the other side will try to voice their disappointment, but ultimately get shut down. Now, there is of course a difference between not liking it and voicing your opinion about it, versus those who just try to attack people personally, without reason. Well, the reason might be, the show is shit, it's bad, that's it, without giving any thorough explanation as to why it's shit. And maybe those people are the reason why you should probably watch the show, even if you don't like parts of it. Because then, you get to make up your own mind, whether you like it or you don't. It's your own opinion. And that matters. In the end, I think that the reason why, or a reason why, a lot of fans keep going on about why they don't like The Acolyte is similar to how a lot of people online start petitions to try and gather enough signatures to have some change occur, because they, as an audience, don't have the executive powers to change the products or the shows or whatever that they like. Now, one person can't bring forth much change, unless you're like, I don't know, PewDiePie or some world-famous influencer who's got a large following. But a lot of individual signatures might do something like that. And I think that's why a lot of people keep going on about this, is that they are not happy, they're not satisfied with the direction that Star Wars is going in under Disney and the new Lucasfilm. But it's difficult to see where Star Wars will end up at this point. And I think when you argue about something in the comment sections or online, I think it's just always important to listen to understand, not just listen to respond or to win an argument. I think it's more important to be reasonable and respectful about the points you're making, and hopefully we can all get along in the end. Now, the first point I want to bring up is, it's funny how Master Vernestra framed Master Sol for being a corrupt or flawed man who did a horrible thing, when she basically covered up his mission to save her own ass. Kind of ironic, don't you think? She basically did the same thing Sol did, covering up a chaotic situation, or trying to cover up a chaotic situation, and we as an audience, we're just supposed to accept that? Vernestra even said that Sol killed his friends. Well, May did that, but May is not held accountable through it all, because Chimere wiped her memory. It's like the worst cliffhanger possible. It's also not like Master Vernestra can't act as a Jedi in all of this, to take some greater responsibility, because her former student has gone rogue, and may be involved in this. She sensed him on Brendok, but still put all the blame on Sol to cover her own ass, and possibly the Jedi as a whole. Because she then goes to confront Master Yoda about all of this, and even though we don't know what kind of conversation Vernestra and Master Yoda had, it's weird how the Jedi don't even sense any of this at all, in the first place. How all these Jedi Masters are dying, and how the Force might be sort of out of balance. Because, this is supposed to be the Jedi at the height of their powers, right? At least without Sith influence within the Senate or the Jedi Council to cloud everything to the same extent as in the prequels. Yet they can't seem to get their shit together, and it's disappointing just to see the direction that Star Wars is going in. Now, you could argue that, well, no one found out that there are Sith around, and they're probably not even Sith, so it's okay. Well, Kymir in some sense referred to himself as a Sith. He mentioned the word. He said, well, to you I might be a Sith. He even mentioned the rule of two, I think, in the cave with Osha, further down in the show, and how he wanted an acolyte or an apprentice. You could say that Kymir didn't clearly state it, but I think his actions showed it. But the Jedi supposedly didn't understand or notice that, possibly due to their weak portrayal in the show. Now, the Jedi might be full of hubris at this point in time, but the audience is not, even if you disregard or ignore their frustrations. So I have this theory that the showrunners basically had to cover up Sol's discovery of how the twins are avergents in the Force and Sol's mission as a whole, because it would most likely interfere with the timeline and setup for the prequel trilogy. That the Jedi Council can't know about it. But the way they presented it all is just disappointing, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. For example, if the Jedi Council can't know about all this, why put a character from the prequel Jedi Council in the show? How did they come to the conclusion, the showrunners, that they wanted to put Ki-Adi-Mundi in that sort of board meeting in episode 4? Having Ki-Adi-Mundi in it, and then Vernestra shutting him down for wanting to tell the High Council about this supposed conspiracy and Jedi Masters dying left, right and center, feels contradicting. It's like the showrunners are creating more challenges and headaches for themselves without considering what might happen next. That Leslie Headland thinks this direction is okay, even though it might cause challenges or issues down the line. For example, again, how she wanted to have Yoda in the Acolyte, but initially got some hesitation or pushback from Lucasfilm about that very thing. But she apparently thought, well, it's my show, and Yoda has been questionable before in the Clone Wars, so then it's apparently okay. And to those people who say, how can all this possibly interfere with the prequels? I would say, have you actually watched the prequels carefully? Listened to the information given there? About how Anakin is a virgin in the Force, unlike anything we've seen before? And how the Sith have been extinct for a millennia? Those are details of great importance, worth paying attention to. Now, there's a difference between dialogue, such as, I'm gonna go buy some milk at the store, instead of, the Sith have been extinct for a millennia, or how Anakin is unlike anything that the Jedi have experienced before in the Force, his midichlorian count being off the charts. Now, I understand how this argument can cause some disagreements about, well, just because it's been done before in the prequels doesn't mean we can't do it again, referring to the idea that even though Anakin had a high midichlorian count and he was supposedly a virgin in the Force, that you can't do that with May and Osha. I think you can do that with certain IDs, but with Anakin it's supposed to be a unique special event or case. Now when you try to copy that and place that event or that case before Anakin, you detract or you reduce the special circumstance about Anakin's story. Now to add to that, I would say, does the show really need May and Osha to be virgins in the Force, or have prequel characters in the show, for the story to function? Probably not. I think it would have created way more mystery and intrigue if we didn't know the exact circumstances as to why the twins are so powerful. There has to be a reason why, of course, but that's where we could explore new ideas. Maybe they're so powerful because Brendock has a strong connection to the Force, that being something they mentioned every now and then, of course, in the show. But what if Brendock had something to do with the dark side? And how Brendock could be a conduit or something for the dark side, and how the planet would attract dark side users and people with high midichlorian counts, or something like that. I think what this all boils down to is that the Acolyte is basically one big middle finger towards the Jedi. It's a critique of the Jedi, that they're not necessarily evil, but they're flawed. They're not necessarily perfect, which is fine, but the Jedi are already flawed in the prequels. They're arrogant and believe that they're in control, when in fact Palpatine, he's planning things in the background. Now, it would have been way more interesting to see a version of the Jedi in the Acolyte where they're more in control, doing actually good things, helping people. But instead, we got more of what feels like the same stuff or content we've had before. You know, in the prequels, the Jedi were already going towards a decline. They were basically screwed. It would have been nice, for once, to see the Jedi actually winning battles, winning fights, and doing good things. Now, George Lucas has mentioned in interviews several years ago about his disappointment and disagreements with the Hollywood system, and studio executives trying to change his movies, etc. How he feels that these days, people, to some extent at least, either just remake old movies, or in some sense fail to innovate or make something new. You know, George always tried to innovate and do something different with each of his movies. Yet, he still tapped into the same source material that he created, so it all felt connected. And even though all the movies had plot holes, of course, it still made sense. It all felt like one universe. And I think that's one of the issues with Star Wars under Disney, is that a lot of the content feel isolated and it doesn't feel like it belongs in the same universe. And I suppose that makes sense because you have George Lucas Star Wars and you have Disney Star Wars, so it's obviously going to be slightly different, but it doesn't feel like the stuff you're already familiar with. And so you're kind of alienating your audience. The second point I want to bring up is that even though the show centers around the idea that you have dark side Force users in Chimera and May, I think it was quite difficult to relate to May because she didn't have a clear path set out in front of her. For a long time, it seemed as if she was committed to getting stronger in the dark side, but she ultimately ended up being too indecisive. Now, I'm not sure how Leslie Headland and the producers think it's okay to let May be indecisive and not necessarily question that. I know that all characters have to go along their own character journey to sort of end up where they're supposed to be, but May still felt somewhat unrelatable and frustrating to watch as a character. I think May is probably, at least partly, but she may be the main reason why everything in the Acolyte happened the way it did. You could say that being indecisive is relatable in the sense that a lot of people in real life tend to be indecisive, and how it could be a reflection of that, and how a lot of people might relate to what May was struggling with. And, you know, to some extent you are right in that you have people in real life that are indecisive, but being indecisive is not necessarily a good thing. It affects the people around you, like we saw with May in the show. Again, I think May is the reason why everything happened the way it did, because May started the fire on Brendok. May did not want Osha to leave, even before Master Sol killed Mother Anisea. Now, May didn't learn to let go. May didn't accept the fact that Osha wanted to go down a different path than her. So you know that the show could have taken a very different turn, not necessarily for the better, we can't know that for certain, but you're just left wondering how different the show could have been if the writers and Leslie decided to portray May in a slightly different way, while still retaining some of the spirit for how they wanted the twins to progress. Now, the last point I'd like to bring up is how May had her mind wiped at the end of the show by Chimera, meaning she can't remember that she killed all of the Jedi Masters from Sol's mission, or at least helped in killing them. Torbin, Indara, Kelnaka, and ultimately Sol. Now I think there's a slight plot hole, or actually a rather big plot hole, on the planet where Torbin drank the poison in that sort of Jedi Temple compound. The Jedi in that temple learned that May was responsible for that death, that May broke into that building, and she got past the security and had Torbin willingly take the poison. Now, did we all just forget about those Jedi? They could actually testify in front of the Jedi Council or the Senate to restore Sol's reputation, even if he's now dead, because Master Vernestra tried to cover it up. So we could actually restore Sol's reputation and then have Master Vernestra face some justice. But, you know, that would make too much sense, and this show can't have any of that. I think that's the main point about the Acolyte. It's not supposed to be clear or make any sense. It's supposed to confuse and miscommunicate, even though the audience might be looking for a resolution at every moment. Now, having gone through all of that, I want to bring up a couple of things that I actually did enjoy or appreciate about the Acolyte, because you do hear a lot of criticism these days about why the Acolyte doesn't work, but I actually think there are a couple of things that the creators did get right. One of them being how we got to see in the last episode a Kyber crystal bleed from blue to red as a result of all the neglected emotions that Osha had. Especially how it took some time for the crystal to change from blue to red, and how it was not just a instant light switch. Another thing is the sound design when Sol and Chimera clashed blades on Brendok. It sounded quite fierce and powerful, and I think the sound design really amplified the idea that these are two powerful characters battling it out. So it's a good example of show, don't tell. So what do you think about all of this? Do any of the points I mentioned make sense or not? I think inevitably, when you put people in charge that don't agree with or support George Lucas's vision of Star Wars, you're going to get an end product that in some way critiques his previous work.
The idea that like that only came from George Lucas, that only George Lucas holds the key for what we understand to be Star Wars is just untrue. And I think the prequels are an excellent example of that. I mean, the idea that like when you're hiring a director, that everyone is sitting in there waiting for George Lucas and not for the person who's going to know to hire Ralph McQuarrie, that's the problem. That's the misogyny and the problem with the auteur myth as it stands today.
And it's totally fine to get Star Wars content that's different and not made by George, but I still think you should try to respect the original or previous material that you are working with, that George sort of laid out through a lot of work and effort. Now, it was obviously a team effort. If Leslie Headland had actually watched the making of featurettes or behind the scenes from the prequels, she would have realized that George actually surrounded himself with a lot of talented artists who would pitch in ideas and come up with solutions to what George was actually looking for. Now, sometimes George gave vague ideas or instructions about what he was looking for, and other times he was actually quite specific in what he wanted. So it was a team effort, and I think that's what made the prequel movies and the original trilogy so special. So keeping all of that in mind, I think it's important when we discuss online, in comment sections or whatever, that we try to be civilized and, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, listen to understand instead of just listening to try and win an argument. Be reasonable. That way, I think we could all get along and actually enjoy Star Wars together.